I remember the silence first. Not normal silence, not the soft quiet of an empty room, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a vampire court. The kind of silence that feels alive, that presses against your chest, that makes every breath feel like a mistake. Because vampires do not breathe, vampires do not fidget, vampires do not whisper like nervous humans. And when hundreds of ancient vampires gather in one throne room, the stillness becomes something unnatural, something predatory, something that reminds you very clearly that you are standing in a place built by creatures who have not needed a heartbeat for centuries. The vampire throne room was vast, far larger than any cathedral I had ever seen, with towering black pillars that rose into shadows so deep the ceiling itself seemed to disappear. Silver flames burning along the walls with a cold light that gave no warmth, no comfort, only illumination, sharp enough to reveal pale faces, glowing eyes, and the endless sea of vampires watching me from every direction. Their bodies perfectly still, their expressions carved from marble indifference, yet their eyes, those terrible, luminous vampire eyes, were fixed on me with a hunger I could feel crawling across my skin. I was the only human in the vampire court, the only mortal, the only one whose chest rose and fell, whose lungs burned with every breath, whose heart beat so violently I was certain everyone could hear it. And perhaps they could, because to vampires a human heartbeat is not just a sound, it is a signal, a rhythm of warmth and blood and life, a reminder of everything they crave and everything they pretend not to need. And as I stood there alone on the cold stone floor, surrounded by ancient predators dressed in silk and armor and shadows, I became painfully aware that my pulse was no longer my own, that it echoed through the throne room like a drum announcing my fragility. I could feel them listening to my heart, every vampire in that court. Some stared openly, their red eyes narrowed, their lips slightly parted, as if imagining how easily that frantic beating could be stopped, how quickly my warm human blood could spill across the black stone. Others looked at me with disgust, offended by the presence of a human in a space they believed belonged only to vampires, only to immortals, only to creatures who had conquered death and now ruled from darkness. A few watched with something colder, sharper, curiosity mixed with calculation, because humans did not simply wander into vampire courts, humans were not invited into royal throne rooms without reason. And beneath the suffocating silence, beneath the weight of immortal attention, I knew they were all asking the same question. Why was I there? At the far end of the hall stood the obsidian throne, black and gleaming like frozen night, its sharp edges catching the silver firelight, its presence dominating the chamber with a terrible authority. And upon that throne sat the vampire king. Lucien. Even from a distance he was impossible to ignore, his body unnaturally still, his posture relaxed yet absolute, his pale face unreadable, his crimson vampire eyes reflecting the cold flames like twin embers of something ancient and merciless. And though hundreds of vampires filled the throne room, though nobles, guards, and lords stood ranked in perfect formation, it was clear that everything in that hall revolved around him. Around the vampire king whose will shaped laws, wars, punishments, and survival itself. My survival. I should have been afraid to look at him. But I wasn't, because fear had already done its worst to me long before I stepped into the vampire court, because terror had burned through my veins during sleepless nights, during whispered warnings, during the long walk through corridors where human footsteps sounded too loud, too alive, too temporary. And by the time I stood beneath the gaze of the vampire king, there was nothing left for fear to take from me except my life. And that, I had already decided, was a price I was willing to risk. The whispers began at the edges of the court, soft movements of sound too low for human ears, yet I could see them in the subtle tilts of pale heads, in the flickers of glowing eyes, in the faint curls of amused vampire smiles. A human. In the vampire court? How bold. How foolish. Their reactions washed over me like cold waves. Hunger, mockery, disdain, and beneath it all something darker. Anticipation, because vampires love spectacle, vampires love humiliation, vampires love watching mortals tremble beneath immortal judgment. And I knew, standing there alone, that many of them expected this to end with my screams. Then he stepped forward. Lord Darius. Tall, elegant, moving with the effortless grace of a vampire noble who had never known weakness, his dark hair falling neatly across his brow, his pale lips curved into a smile that did not reach his eyes, a smile sharpened by cruelty, and as he walked toward me, the vampires parted without hesitation, granting space to a predator who outranked them not by kindness, but by power. "Well," Darius said, his voice smooth, echoing across the throne room, "this is unexpected." He circled me slowly like a wolf circling prey, his red eyes tracing the line of my throat, the pulse fluttering beneath my skin, the tension I could not completely hide, and though he never touched me, I could feel the weight of his presence, the cold promise of what he could do if he chose. "We gather for matters of vampire law and vampire war," he continued lazily, "and instead—" He stopped behind me. "We are given entertainment." Laughter rippled through the vampire court, low and dark, the sound of ancient beings amused by the absurdity of a human standing among them. Darius stepped in front of me again, tilting his head. "Tell me, human," he said gently, cruelly, "do you truly believe your story?" My hands were trembling, my heart was racing, but my voice did not break. "I do not believe it," I said quietly. I met his eyes. I remember it. The laughter faltered, not gone, but thinner, uneasy, because certainty from a human was not entertaining. It was unsettling. "Ah, yes," Darius murmured. "The claim." He turned away from me, addressing the entire vampire court, his voice rising with theatrical amusement. "This human girl," he gestured toward me as if presenting a curiosity, "claims the vampire king owes her a blood debt." For one suspended moment, silence. Then, the vampire court exploded. Vampires laughed openly, cruelly, ancient nobles delighted by what they believed was mortal madness, their laughter crashing through the hall like a storm of mockery. A human? Owed by the vampire king? How delightful. How pathetic. The sound cut through me, sharp and humiliating, yet I did not lower my gaze, did not shrink, did not surrender to the weight of their amusement, because this reaction, this cruelty, this disbelief was exactly what I had expected, exactly what I had come for, because truth, when first spoken in a room full of monsters, is always greeted with laughter. Slowly, as the echoes of vampire mockery filled the throne room, I lifted my eyes, past Darius, past the nobles, toward the obsidian throne, toward Lucienne. Because in the end, only one vampire mattered, and as the laughter raged around me as ancient predators mocked my existence, I saw it. A movement. Small, almost imperceptible, but enough. On the throne, the vampire king leaned forward, his crimson eyes locked onto mine, not amused, not dismissive, but watching, remembering. And in that single terrible moment, as the vampire court continued to laugh, unaware that their cruelty was seconds away from turning into something else entirely, I knew. The silence was coming back. I could feel the change in the vampire court the moment I began revealing the past, because the air itself seemed to tighten, because the mocking energy that had filled the throne room only moments ago slowly dissolved into something far heavier and far more dangerous. A silence shaped not by boredom but by attention, because vampires may enjoy cruelty, may delight in humiliation, but they also understand the weight of history, the gravity of blood, the terrifying significance of anything connected to their king, and as hundreds of ancient vampire eyes fixed upon me with sharpened focus, I realized there was no retreat left, no safety in hesitation, no protection in softening the truth. The memory rose inside me like a storm I had never truly escaped, cold and violent and endless, dragging me backward through years, through fear, through a night that had carved itself into my bones so deeply that even now, standing beneath the silver flames of a vampire throne room, I could still feel the bite of winter air in my lungs, the numbness creeping into my fingers, the exhaustion that had made every step through the snow feel like surrender, because 5 years ago I had not been standing in a palace of vampires, had not been surrounded by creatures of immortality and shadow, but wandering half lost on the northern border where survival was never guaranteed and mercy was a concept the land itself did not recognize. The storm had been merciless, a white howling chaos that erased roads, swallowed tracks, and tore apart the fragile illusions of control humans cling to. Our small merchant caravan scattered like leaves before a furious wind, horses collapsing under the crushing weight of snow, wagons overturned, voices lost in the screaming gale, and I remember stumbling forward with lungs burning and vision blurred, my world reduced to freezing air and endless white, my thoughts growing slow and distant beneath the creeping numbness that whispers so softly of rest, of sleep, of simply lying down and letting the cold take everything. And then I saw him, half buried in snow, motionless, his dark cloak torn by violence, his pale skin smeared with blood so stark against the white that for a moment my frozen mind could not understand what I was looking at, could not reconcile the sight of a body that was neither fully covered nor fully exposed, neither clearly alive nor clearly dead. Only an impossible shape of darkness and stillness lying where no living thing should have survived such a storm. I had not known he was a vampire. I had not known he was the vampire king. I had only known that someone was dying. Silver arrows pierced his chest, their shafts jutting outward like cruel markers of deliberate execution, their metal tips buried deep in flesh that should have healed but did not, because silver is poison to vampires, silver is agony, silver is death that refuses to come quickly. And even before I understood what he truly was, even before fear fully awakened inside me, I could see the tension locked into his unnaturally still features, the silent violence of suffering etched across a face that did not breathe, did not move, did not react like any human I had ever seen. He was colder than the snow beneath him, colder than death itself, yet not dead. Not entirely. Because immortality does not surrender easily, because vampires linger in that terrible space between existence and oblivion when wounded by silver, trapped in bodies that cannot heal and cannot die, condemned to endure pain that would shatter mortal minds, and kneeling there in the storm, my own life hanging by a fragile thread, I understood only one terrible certainty. If I left him there, the rising sun would finish what silver had begun. I should have fled. Every instinct of survival, every warning ever whispered about vampires, every story of fangs and blood and death should have driven me away from that frozen, bleeding stranger, because humans are prey in the world of vampires, because mortals do not rescue predators, because kindness toward a vampire can so easily become suicide. But exhaustion dulls fear. Desperation rewrites logic. And something in that still, tortured face anchored me in place. My fingers were numb as I reached for the arrows, my thoughts blurred by cold and terror, yet the reality before me was undeniable. Silver embedded deep in flesh. Silver that had to be removed or allowed to complete its slow, merciless work. And though my hands trembled violently, though my heart pounded in panic, I wrapped my frozen fingers around the shaft of the first arrow and pulled. The reaction was immediate and horrifying, his body convulsing with a force that shattered the illusion of lifelessness, a silent eruption of agony tearing through the storm, blood spilling hot and dark across my hands, steam rising where it touched the snow, the violence of his pain so raw and overwhelming that for one frozen heartbeat I nearly recoiled in terror, nearly fled from the monstrous reality of what I had touched. But I did not stop, because stopping meant death. Because retreat meant dawn. Because leaving silver inside a vampire's chest was not mercy. One by one I tore the arrows free, each movement met with terrible silent spasms, each removal releasing more dark blood into the snow, until finally he collapsed again into stillness. His strength spent, his immortality crippled, his existence reduced to a fragile thread stretched thin beneath a sky already whispering of sunrise. Dragging him through the storm had been madness. His body impossibly heavy, my limbs trembling with exhaustion, snow swallowing my legs with every step, the wind clawing at my skin like something determined to strip away flesh itself. Yet the ruin of a broken chapel emerged through the white chaos like a final desperate promise, shattered stone walls rising from ice and silence, its roof long collapsed, but its shadows deep enough to hide from the coming sun. I pulled him into darkness, into shelter, into a space where dawn could not reach. And there, in the frozen silence of that ruined chapel, surrounded by broken stone and drifting snow, I waited through the longest night of my life, watching a wounded vampire fight poison that burned from within, watching immortal flesh struggle to repair damage silver had carved deep into eternity-bound veins, watching a being who should have been untouchable reduced to something terrifyingly fragile. He could have killed me when strength returned. He could have fed. He could have ended my life without hesitation. Yet even in pain, even in weakness, he remained trapped in that unnatural stillness, his existence suspended between survival and oblivion, until desperation drove me toward the one act no human should ever consider, the one act every story warns against. I cut my own skin, because he could not hunt, because he would not survive dawn without blood, because immortality had abandoned him for one terrible night. My blood was warm against the freezing air, crimson life spilling from mortal flesh, the scent rising sharp and overwhelming in the darkness of the chapel, and though terror screamed inside my skull, though instinct begged me to stop, I pressed my wrist to his lips and allowed the Vampire King to drink. The transformation was immediate and terrifying, a violent resurgence of power rippling through his motionless form, his body reacting to human blood like fire touching oil, the poison's hold weakening, the stillness fracturing, strength crawling slowly back into limbs that had hovered so close to death. And when the sun rose, he did not burn, because stone and shadow held, because blood had healed, because death had been denied. He woke hours later, crimson eyes opening with a clarity that did not belong to the dying stranger I had dragged through the snow, awareness returning with terrible intensity, memory flooding a gaze that suddenly held centuries, power, and something far more dangerous than hunger. Recognition, understanding, knowledge of exactly who and what he was, and who had saved him. Even now, years later, standing in the vampire court beneath hundreds of watchful eyes, I could still feel the weight of that moment, the cold terror of realizing I had not rescued a wounded traveler, but the Vampire King himself, ruler of monsters, master of darkness, a being whose existence reshaped laws, whose survival altered destinies, whose debt could bind eternity. Because blood debts among vampires are sacred, ancient, unbreakable, and I had saved the life of a king. The silence that followed my confession did not feel like the earlier silence of the vampire court, because before there had been mockery beneath it, cruelty coiled like a serpent ready to strike, amusement flickering in the red eyes of ancient vampires who believed they were witnessing nothing more than the unraveling of a foolish human girl. Yet now the silence was different, heavier, stretched tight with something far more dangerous than laughter, because truth had entered the throne room like a blade, because memory had been dragged from the grave of years, because every vampire present understood that certain words, once spoken, could not be dismissed, could not be erased, could not be reduced to entertainment. I could feel them staring at me, not with hunger now, but with calculation, with disbelief fighting against recognition, with fear slowly awakening beneath immortal pride. The vampire nobles who had laughed moments ago stood motionless as statues, their pale faces emptied of cruel amusement, their glowing eyes sharp and watchful. Because blood debts were not myths among vampires. Blood debts were law, ancient and sacred, binding obligations that outranked titles, outranked territories, outranked even the authority of a vampire king. And as the weight of my story settled over the court like falling ash, I sensed the shift moving through them like a ripple across still water. No one moved. No one breathed. Even the silver flames along the walls seemed to burn more quietly, their cold light reflecting against black stone and polished armor, illuminating rows of frozen vampire faces that no longer looked entertained, no longer looked amused, but tense with a dread that grew stronger with every passing heartbeat. My heartbeat. Wild. Relentless. Echoing through a room full of still vampire bodies. At the far end of the hall, upon the obsidian throne that had witnessed centuries of judgment and execution, sat Lucien, the vampire king whose presence had always dominated the chamber, with an effortless, terrible authority. Yet now his stillness felt charged with something deeper, something volatile and ancient, because my words had not merely challenged the pride of the vampire court, They had reached directly into the past of their king, into a night of weakness no noble wished to imagine, into a memory that could not exist without consequence. His crimson eyes were locked on me, unblinking, unreadable, but no longer distant, no longer coldly detached. There was something else there now, something that tightened the air between us, something that made the vast throne room feel suddenly smaller, narrower, as if the centuries themselves were leaning forward to witness what would happen next. I had told my truth. Now the Vampire King had to face his. The tension became unbearable because silence inside a vampire court is never empty, silence is anticipation, silence is the slow drawing of a blade before it falls, and as I stood alone beneath the crushing weight of immortal attention, my pulse racing, my thoughts flickering between terror and resolve, I became acutely aware that everything in that throne room, every vampire noble, every guard, every ancient predator, was waiting for only one thing: the reaction of the Vampire King. Because if Lucian denied my story, if he dismissed my memory as human madness, the court would tear me apart without hesitation, my fate sealed by immortal contempt, my truth buried beneath laughter and blood. But if he remembered, if he acknowledged, if the Vampire King confirmed the blood debt, the consequences would shake the foundations of the vampire kingdom itself. Slowly, with a movement so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by human eyes, yet thundered through the awareness of every vampire present, Lucien leaned forward upon his throne, his pale fingers tightening against the black stone armrest, his crimson gaze burning with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through my fragile mortal composure. And though no words filled the air, though no sound broke the suffocating stillness, I felt it in that moment, a shift not merely of posture but of presence, as if something ancient and deeply buried had stirred awake behind those immortal eyes. The vampire court sensed it too. I saw it ripple through them, shoulders stiffening, eyes widening, predatory confidence fracturing beneath uncertainty, because vampires understand their king, understand the language of his stillness, understand the difference between indifference and remembrance, and this was not indifference. Memory flickered across Lucien's face like distant lightning beneath ice, so faint yet so unmistakable that the sight sent a shock through the throne room more powerful than any scream. Because the Vampire King, eternal and untouchable, was no longer the flawless predator upon the obsidian throne, but a being confronting the return of something painfully human, painfully vulnerable. A night when silver arrows had pierced immortal flesh, when power had failed, when survival had depended not on strength or terror but on the impossible mercy of a mortal girl. My memory, his memory, now colliding in the center of the vampire court. The air grew colder, heavier, because truth has gravity, because remembrance is a form of surrender, because a vampire king does not lean forward like that unless something has cracked within the armor of centuries. I could feel my breath catching in my throat, my heart slamming against my ribs, fear rising sharp and violent inside my chest, because this was the moment upon which my entire fate balanced, the fragile line between vindication and execution, between power and annihilation. Lucien's eyes did not leave mine. Not for a second, not for a heartbeat. And then he stood. The movement shattered the stillness like breaking glass, the Vampire King rising from the obsidian throne with a slow, terrible grace that seemed to drain the strength from the room itself. Because when a king of vampires stands, the court does not merely observe, it reacts with instinctive ancient recognition, power, answering power, hierarchy tightening like a noose. The vampire nobles recoiled almost imperceptibly, not in fear of attack, but in fear of truth. Because kings do not rise for madness. Kings do not rise for lies. Kings rise for things that matter. Lucien descended the black steps of his throne with measured, predatory calm, his presence expanding across the chamber like a spreading shadow, crimson eyes blazing, pale face carved from something colder than rage, yet far more dangerous, because anger can be anticipated, defiance can be challenged, but remembrance, acknowledgement, acceptance of a blood debt owed to a human. That was chaos. That was rupture. That was the breaking of centuries-old certainty. I could feel the vampire court trembling beneath the weight of it, though no one dared move, though no one dared speak, because the vampire king carried with him not merely authority, but inevitability, and as he crossed the vast distance that separated throne from mortal, immortality from fragility, predator from prey, I understood with a clarity so sharp it stole the air from my lungs that this was no longer my story alone. This was the king's reckoning. He stopped before me, close enough that I could feel the unnatural cold radiating from his immortal body, could see the ancient depth burning within crimson eyes that had witnessed 6 centuries of war, betrayal, survival, and loss. Yet beneath that terrible majesty, beneath the inhuman stillness, I saw it. Recognition, certainty, memory no longer denied. The silence became absolute, because now there was no doubt left, no ambiguity, no refuge in disbelief. The vampire court, ancient and merciless, waited as their king stood before the human girl who had dared claim power over eternity, who had dared speak of weakness, who had dared invoke the sacred laws of blood. And in that vast throne room of shadows and silver fire, where humans were prey and vampires were gods, the vampire king remembered. Fear spread through the court like poison, subtle yet unstoppable, because every vampire present understood the implication without needing words. Understood that acknowledgement of a blood debt would bind their king to a human, would elevate a mortal life beyond its natural insignificance, would fracture the delicate balance of pride, law, and power upon which the vampire hierarchy rested. Ancient nobles who had ruled territories for centuries felt uncertainty coil inside their immortal chests. Guards who feared nothing felt tension sharpen their senses. Predators who had laughed at my claim now stared at me as if seeing something entirely different. Not prey, not entertainment, but a threat shaped by law itself. And though no voice yet broke the silence, though no decree yet echoed across the black stone walls, I knew standing there beneath the burning gaze of the vampire king that the moment of judgment had arrived, that truth was seconds away from being carved into the history of the vampire court, that whatever Lucien chose now would reshape not only my fate, but the fate of every vampire who had dared laugh at a human claiming a king's debt. Because remembrance is power, because truth is irreversible, because blood debts are eternal. The moment stretched into something unnatural, into a span of time that no longer felt measured by seconds or breaths, but by the unbearable weight of anticipation pressing down upon every living and unliving thing inside the vampire court. Because Lucien, the vampire king, stood before me in absolute stillness, his crimson eyes locked onto mine with a gaze that held centuries of power, memory, and something far more dangerous than anger. While behind him the vast throne room remained frozen beneath silver firelight, hundreds of ancient vampires suspended in a silence so complete it seemed the entire palace itself had stopped to witness what would happen next. I could feel my heart beating wildly against my ribs, the frantic rhythm echoing through the cold air like a drum of mortal defiance, and though fear coiled tight inside my chest, though every instinct screamed at me to look away, to bow, to surrender to the overwhelming presence of the Predator King standing only a breath away, I refused to lower my gaze, because this was the edge of everything, the fragile line between truth and annihilation, between vindication and death, between being dismissed as a foolish human girl and becoming something far more terrifying, a mortal bound to the vampire king by sacred law. Lucien's face remained unreadable, carved from that cold, perfect stillness that defined all vampires yet elevated to something even more terrifying in a king. Because where lesser vampires revealed hunger, cruelty, or amusement, the vampire king revealed nothing, no flicker of doubt, no trace of hesitation, only that terrible intensity burning behind crimson eyes that now carried the undeniable weight of remembrance, and as the silence deepened, as the vampire court waited with predatory tension humming beneath their motionless forms, I realized that this was not merely a decision, not merely a confirmation of past events, but a fracture point in the very structure of vampire power. Because blood debts were older than thrones, older than kingdoms, older than Lucien himself, and if the vampire king acknowledged that debt, He would not simply validate my story. He would bind himself to it. The air in the throne room felt colder now, impossibly cold, as if the ancient stone itself understood the gravity of what hovered unspoken between king and mortal, while the silver flames cast long, trembling shadows across the black floor, illuminating rows of vampire nobles whose pale faces had hardened into masks of dread, disbelief, and dawning fear. Because they, more than anyone, understood the consequences of truth shaped by law, understood that if Lucien confirmed the debt, the human girl they had mocked moments ago would no longer be an amusing intrusion, but a living symbol of obligation imposed upon immortality. I could see it in their eyes. Calculation, unease, the slow erosion of certainty. Because vampires thrive on hierarchy, on dominance, on the unchallenged supremacy of their king, and the idea that a human, fragile, aging, mortal, could hold a claim recognized by ancient law was not merely unsettling, it was destabilizing, a crack in the flawless illusion of eternal control. Lucien did not move, yet his presence changed. I felt it like a pressure shift before a storm. Because remembrance was no longer flickering behind his gaze, it had settled, hardened into certainty, into acceptance of a past that could not be rewritten. He remembered the snow, the silver arrows, the ruined chapel, the blood. He remembered weakness, and he remembered me. A tremor passed through the vampire court, subtle yet undeniable, as if a silent wave of realization had rippled outward from the stillness between us, because ancient predators possess instincts sharpened by centuries, instincts that detect truth before words confirm it, and though no decree yet echoed across the chamber, though no sound yet shattered the silence, I sensed the shift moving through them like fear made visible, shoulders stiffening, glowing eyes widening, hunger replaced by something colder and far more fragile. Uncertainty. Because if the vampire king remembered, then denial was no longer possible. Lucien turned slowly, not away from me, but toward his court, toward the assembly of ancient vampires whose power, pride, and survival were woven tightly into the authority of the throne. The movement was deliberate, measured, and devastating, because now every vampire present could see his face clearly, could see the absence of mockery, the absence of dismissal, the terrible gravity etched into immortal stillness. And in that frozen moment, before any word was spoken, before any law was invoked aloud, the vampire court understood. Truth had won. Fear spread like poison through the chamber, silent yet explosive, because blood debts are sacred among vampires, binding obligations that even kings cannot ignore, cannot escape, cannot diminish without shattering the laws that uphold their entire society, and the realization that Lucien, their untouchable vampire king, stood on the verge of confirming such a debt to a human, struck the court with the force of catastrophe. I could feel it in the air. The sharp tension, the silent panic, because vampires feared many things: silver, sunlight, betrayal. But above all, they feared imbalance, feared anything that threatened the rigid structure of power that separated ruler from subject, predator from prey, immortal from mortal. And I, a human girl with a beating heart, had become exactly that threat. Lucien's crimson eyes swept across the court, his gaze cold, ancient, absolute, and though no anger twisted his features, though no rage darkened his expression, his presence alone silenced every thought of protest before it could form, because this was the authority of a vampire king who had ruled for centuries, who had crushed rebellions, who had drowned enemies in blood, who now stood not as a predator confronting prey, but as a sovereign confronting truth. Then he spoke. The sound of his voice shattered the silence like a blade striking stone, low, cold, and utterly final, reverberating through the vast throne room with a weight that seemed to freeze even the silver flames along the walls. Because kings do not raise their voices, kings do not need fury to command terror, and the words that followed carried not emotion, but judgment, recognition, confirmation, law. He declared the truth. He confirmed the memory. He acknowledged the debt. The impact was immediate and catastrophic, a silent explosion of fear ripping through the vampire court as ancient nobles recoiled in disbelief, as predatory confidence fractured beneath the crushing reality of sacred obligation. Because with that single confirmation, the hierarchy of centuries shifted, the mocked human transformed into something else entirely. A living bearer of a blood debt owed by the vampire king himself. I could feel it, their eyes on me, no longer amused, no longer hungry, but wary, because I was no longer invisible, no longer insignificant, no longer merely human. I had become law made flesh. The throne room trembled with tension as Lucien's decree settled like falling ash over ancient stone, as the truth echoed through immortal minds that struggled to comprehend the scale of what had just occurred, because blood debts bind eternity, because sacred law outranks pride, because a vampire king acknowledging obligation to a mortal threatened not only political stability, but the psychological foundations of vampire supremacy. And yet, none dared challenge him. Because truth spoken by a king is absolute. Because denial is impossible when memory stands beside power. Because fear silences even immortals. I stood there trembling, my heart racing, my breath uneven, the enormity of what had just unfolded crashing over me in waves of disbelief and terror, because I had not merely survived the vampire court, had not merely proven my story, but altered my place within a kingdom of predators, my existence now protected not by mercy or affection, but by the most terrifying force in the vampire world: obligation. Because a blood debt from a vampire king is sacred. Because repayment is inevitable. Because law now stood between me and every hungry gaze in that throne room. And as fear rippled through the ancient assembly, as whispers of shock and dread slithered through immortal ranks, as the silver flames flickered against black stone and obsidian throne, I understood the terrible truth of my victory. I had not escaped danger. I had become the center of it. Because vampires do not forgive disruption. Because nobles do not forget humiliation. Because a human who binds a vampire king by law becomes not merely protected, but hunted by resentment, envy, and fear. Yet beneath the terror, beneath the crushing awareness of what waited beyond this moment, something steadier rose within me. Because truth had been spoken, because silence had been broken, because the vampire king himself had remembered. And in a court of ancient vampires, where immortality ruled and mortals were meant to vanish without consequence, a human girl had changed the balance of power. If a vampire king spoke your truth before his court, would you feel protected or realize you had just become the most hunted human alive? Like, comment and subscribe for the next gem.